Bum bum ba-dum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-da-dum bum ba-dum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-dum bum bum.
Welcome to Everyday Musicality, the podcast in which we discuss all things related to Gordon's music learning theory and how it can help unlock the inner musician that lives inside of all of us. I'm your host, Heather Shouldice, music educator and faculty member for the Gordon Institute for Music Learning. In this episode, we'll wrap up our second series, which centers around the whole-part-whole learning process that is central to MLT. Today, I'll give an overview of the skill learning sequence framework, in which we'll look at the various musical skills students can develop when interacting with musical content. Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Musicality podcast. Today is an exciting day because at the end of this episode, I'll be announcing the winner of the second giveaway from sponsor GIA Publications. A big thank you to everyone who entered by sharing the podcast on social media. A big thank you also to listener Amy Marin, who emailed me with some feedback a few weeks ago. Amy wrote, "Dear Heather, I just listened to your episode Taste of Tonalities, and it was just what I've been looking for. I noted all the resources you mentioned at the end, but I could really benefit from a whole episode on each tonality where you give more practice on being able to identify the tonality and give more opportunity to hear someone singing, and also doing some repetition exercises." Well, Amy, you must be psychic because I've been planning on doing just that. I'm glad to know that that would be helpful, and I'm currently brainstorming ideas for those episodes. I would love to hear any other suggestions or questions that any of you might have, so please send them my way at everydaymusicality@gmail.com. Today we're going to wrap up the second series of this podcast in which we've been talking about the whole-part-whole learning process in MLT. First, we differentiated between musical context and musical content in episode 5. Remember that in the whole-part-whole process, the whole refers to context, which students experience through repertoire. The basis for tonal and rhythmic context is tonality and meter, which we focused on in episodes 6 and 7, called Taste of Tonalities and Menu of Meters. Then, in episode 8, we talked about the part of the whole-part-whole process, which refers to content, tonal patterns, and rhythm patterns. By interacting with tonal patterns and rhythm patterns, students will return to the whole with greater understanding. Because students build a vocabulary of tonal patterns and rhythm patterns and practice using that pattern vocabulary, they better understand how music is put together and can listen to and make music with greater meaning. Remember that in the last episode, I mentioned that pattern instruction doesn't just involve echoing patterns. There are a whole variety of skills that can be developed through pattern instruction, which then can be applied to the repertoire that students are listening to, performing, or creating. Back in episode 4 on common misconceptions about MLT, I mentioned that some people assume MLT only involves rote learning through pattern echoing. Now, while pattern echoing is an important part of building musical vocabulary, just as imitating words is an important part of building language vocabulary, the goal of pattern instruction is to help students develop audiation and build a functional musical vocabulary so that they better understand music and can engage with music independently in a variety of ways. For that reason, in MLT, we help students engage with patterns and repertoire in a lot of different ways, developing a wide variety of musical skills. So today I'm going to give an overview of Gordon's skill learning sequence, which he developed based on the work of educational psychologist Robert Gagne. This skill learning sequence framework builds on the core tenet of sequential music learning, which I discussed back in episode 3. And it's what you would probably see if you were to open up a music education textbook that provides a quick introduction to common teaching approaches like Orff and Kodai. Now, sadly, some people see this skill learning sequence framework and either think it's strange because it uses terms they've never seen before that were created by Gordon, like partial synthesis, or they think it's a prescriptive method of steps. But remember, MLT is not a method. There are infinite ways that you could implement this skill learning sequence in your instructional decision making. And the beauty of the skill learning sequence is that once you've wrapped your head around it, it enables you to make flexible teaching decisions that are responsive to what your students need at any given point in time. The hard part, though, is wrapping your brain around the skill learning sequence, understanding the terminology, and getting a sense of how it can be used. So, in today's episode, I'll introduce you to the basics of Gordon's skill learning sequence, and then we'll dig deeper into each of the levels in future episodes. Now, before we start getting into the skill learning sequence, I wanted to mention that I've added a link in the show notes to a chart that gives a visual representation of the skill learning sequence. I highly suggest that you have that chart handy as you listen to this episode so that you can see how the ideas relate to one another. Also, if you're new to MLT, I highly suggest you go back and listen to episode number 3 on sequential music learning before you listen to this episode, because it provides the big picture behind the skill learning sequence. In episode 3, I talked about parallels between the music learning process and the language learning process. How, just like with language, we learn music first by hearing lots of music and starting to imitate and play around with the sounds we're hearing. And then we develop the ability to have a conversation through music, to have and express our own musical thoughts. Only after we can make music by ear and spontaneously express our own musical ideas through improvisation should we learn to read and write music notation, and then long after that, to learn the theory behind how music is put together. The skill learning sequence we're going to talk about today is really just an expansion of that sequence. So to get us into the skill learning sequence, let's first differentiate between content and skills. Content, and also context, tend to be nouns, like major tonic function, minor dominant, duple meter, so on. So those are nouns. That's content and also context. Skills, on the other hand, are verbs. Skills are what we do with the content in a particular context. Skills are how we interact with the musical material. Examples of skills are things like singing, chanting, labeling, improvising, identifying. So skills are verbs. And the thing is that whenever we are guiding students in learning something, we are always combining content and skill. For example, if students are learning the content of major tonic function, what are they doing with that content? Are they singing major tonic patterns? Are they labeling major tonic patterns? Are they improvising major tonic patterns? Are they reading or writing major tonic patterns? So we have to be conscious of the skill students are practicing with the content they're learning. Conversely, in order to learn a skill, we have to think about what the content is that students are applying skills to. So skills and content go hand in hand. You can never do one without the other. And the skills are what you're doing with the content. Now, the whole point of thinking about content and skills is that the appropriate sequencing of both skills and content helps to maximize learning while minimizing frustration. When we engage students in sequential music learning experiences, developing musical skills and knowledge requires minimal effort because students have been given the sequential readiness for each step in the learning process. So let's start looking at how the skill learning sequence can facilitate this sort of effortless learning. Again, I highly suggest that you have that chart handy that I linked to in the show notes. The first thing to know about the skill learning sequence is that it's structured around 2 different types of learning. Those are discrimination learning and inference learning. If you look at the chart, you'll see that it's separated into 2 columns, discrimination and inference. In discrimination learning, the teacher directly models skills for the students so that students have an opportunity to start learning by rote. In this way, the teacher is always giving the answer in discrimination learning. They're always modeling what to do. Therefore, discrimination learning involves familiar musical material or familiar patterns. In contrast, inference learning always involves some amount of unfamiliar material because the defining feature of inference learning is that students are teaching themselves. In inference learning, students are figuring out something on their own or they're creating their own musical material. So again, discrimination learning deals with familiar material, and the teacher is modeling the skills for students. And inference learning, students are learning unfamiliar material that they are teaching themselves. If you take nothing else away from this episode, if you start to get overwhelmed by all the levels of skill learning sequence that I'm going to talk about, if nothing else, at least appreciate the differences between discrimination learning and inference learning. This is important because students' success with inference learning, their success with figuring things out or creating their own music, is dependent on the discrimination learning they've had. Inference learning requires students to teach themselves something unfamiliar, which they do by inferring from what is familiar. Therefore, discrimination learning provides essential readiness for inference learning. Your students' success with inference learning directly depends on the quality and extensiveness of their discrimination learning experiences. Therefore, if a student struggles with inference learning, it is often because they didn't get enough discrimination learning experiences to enable them to make the inferences. So we need to be aware of when we're asking students to make inferences and really think about whether we've prepared them to be successful. And if students struggle with inference learning, we need to not assume that they're just not talented, because everyone has music aptitude, as we discussed in episode 2, right? Some students will just be ready to make those inferences sooner than others, or need us as the teachers to differentiate the content they're making inferences with. Okay, so let's recap that first big takeaway. Discrimination learning deals with familiar material in which someone, in our case we'll say the teacher, is modeling the skill, while inference learning deals with unfamiliar material in which students are teaching themselves independently. And the second big takeaway is that students' ability to make those inferences directly depends on their experiences with discrimination learning. These two types of learning in the skill learning sequence are broken down into 8 different skill levels. There are 5 levels of discrimination learning and 3 levels of inference learning. Each of these 8 levels encompasses a variety of specific musical skills that can be learned and applied in conjunction with various musical content. Before I run through these levels, I want to emphasize that it is not necessary for all levels of discrimination learning to be experienced before moving to an inference level. And students can and often are learning tonal and rhythm content at different skill levels simultaneously. After I run through all 8 skill levels, I'll talk a little bit more about this. First, though, a warning. I am going to zoom through these levels, so if this is your first exposure to these ideas, it might be a bit of a blur. I'm not going to lie. I promise I'll be breaking down each of these levels more in future episodes, and I break them down a ton in my book that I'm finishing up. But for today, we're just going to do a really fast drive-by of the 8 levels of skill learning sequence. Let's look first at the levels of discrimination learning, which starts with the skill level called aural. The aural, A-U-R-A-L, implies listening, and the oral, O-R-A-L, implies speaking, or in our case, performing music orally. Aural, oral, listening, and performing. So at the aural skill level, we develop audiation and a vocabulary of patterns through listening and performing. Now, when I say performing, I don't necessarily mean performing for others, but simply making music, which could include singing, chanting, playing instruments without notation, and moving to music. At the aural skill level, we learn to audiate and perform the resting tone and macrobeat and microbeat of familiar material, and to audiate and perform familiar tonal patterns and rhythm patterns. And all of this is done on neutral syllables. So we don't use tonal solfege or rhythm syllables at the aural level. Instead, we use neutral syllables like ba or bum. So when we sing tonal patterns at the aural level, they're typically sung on bum, like bum bum bum, bum 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 bum, bum bum. When we chant rhythm patterns at the aural level, they're typically chanted on ba, like ba 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 ba. Now, neutral syllables doesn't mean we can't perform songs or chants with lyrics, just that we don't use tonal or rhythm syllables. So again, at the aural level, students are listening and doing and are performing patterns on neutral syllables rather than solfege. One more important part of aural learning is that students are learning all skills via a musical model. So the teacher models the skills before asking students to respond. For example, if the skill being learned were to audiate and sing the resting tone of a song in minor tonality, at oral, the teacher would make sure to model singing the resting tone on bum before asking the students to sing it. If the teacher were to ask the students to independently find the resting tone, that would be a level of inference learning. But first, students need to be given the tools to make that kind of inference through discrimination learning. So at the oral level, students are learning content with neutral syllables rather than solfege and are learning in response to a musical model. The second level of discrimination learning is verbal association, and this is when tonal solfege and rhythm syllables are added. In verbal association, solfege syllables are now superimposed on familiar tonal patterns and familiar rhythm patterns that were learned previously at the oral level. Tonal solfege and rhythm syllables can also be added to the resting tone or the macrobeats and microbeats learned in familiar tonalities or meters at verbal association. In addition, the syllables are used as a tool to help students learn to associate names to tonalities, meters, and pattern functions that they have previously experienced at the oral level. So at verbal association, students might learn to recognize that when they're audiating do-day as the microbeats, that's duple meter, or to recognize that a combination of do, mi, or so is a major tonic pattern. And remember, this is discrimination learning, so the teacher is still modeling the skills and providing the answers before expecting students to answer or perform the skills. So verbal association, again, means students are learning to perform the familiar material they learned at oral, now with tonal solfege or rhythm syllables, and to name tonalities, meters, and functions. The third level of discrimination learning is partial synthesis. Partial synthesis gets its name because it synthesizes the first two levels, oral and verbal association. At the partial synthesis level of learning, we start to assimilate the sounds learned at oral with the syllables and names learned at verbal association by recognizing tonal or rhythm context with the syllables removed. The goal of partial synthesis is for students to start learning to compare and recognize tonalities or meters of familiar content without the syllables being present. Also, because partial synthesis is about starting to recognize context, the focus is not on individual patterns. In partial synthesis, familiar patterns are chunked into a series of patterns so that together they imply objective tonality or meter. So, for example, I might perform a series of patterns in one familiar tonality or meter and the same series of patterns in a different familiar tonality or meter and show the students how to recognize and label each context. For instance, I might sing bum 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 bum. In the first set of patterns, you should have been audiating do, mi, so as the tonic, so the first one was in major tonality. In the second set of patterns, you should have been audiating la, do, mi as the tonic, so the second set of patterns was in minor tonality. Then I would sing those two series of patterns for the students to practice recognizing which tonic pattern and tonality name correspond with each series. At the partial synthesis level, students also learn to recognize the tonality or meter of familiar songs or chants performed in two familiar contexts. And remember, since this is discrimination learning, the teacher always tells the answers before asking students to recognize and name the tonality or meter. So I would model both contexts and walk students through how to recognize them both before I would then model one of those contexts in the exact same way and have students recognize it. So partial synthesis, again, means students are learning to compare and recognize contexts of familiar material learned at oral and verbal association with the syllables taken away. I know partial synthesis is a lot to take in the first time you hear about it. It took me years to understand partial synthesis, if I'm being honest. So if it doesn't completely make sense right now, that's okay. Let's just move along to the next level and we'll come back to it in a future episode. The fourth level of discrimination learning is symbolic association, and this is when students start learning to read and write music notation. It's called symbolic association because students begin to learn to associate the symbols of music notation to the sounds they can already audiate. Symbolic association. They learn to associate symbols of music notation to the sounds they can already audiate. So students learn to read and write familiar tonal patterns and familiar rhythm patterns at symbolic association. The most important thing to remember about symbolic association is that we don't focus on things like letter names of pitches on the staff or time value names, and we don't explain the theory behind the symbols like half steps and whole steps or things like a dot increases a note by half its original value. We do not talk about those things at symbolic association. At the symbolic association level, students learn to read and write familiar patterns based on how they sound. So they use tonal solfege or rhythm syllables to read and write familiar patterns. And the teacher models each pattern before the students are asked to read or write it. So again, symbolic association simply means that students learn to associate symbols to the familiar patterns they've learned in previous levels, using syllables as a tool. The fifth and final level of discrimination learning, I'm just going to quickly mention, it's called composite synthesis. Composite synthesis gets its name because it synthesizes the partial synthesis and symbolic association levels of learning. So in a nutshell, at the composite synthesis level of learning, we learn to read or write a series of familiar patterns while also recognizing its tonality or meter. That's enough about that for right now. So before we move on to the inference levels, let's quickly recap the discrimination levels. First, aural, listening to and performing musical sounds on neutral syllables. Second, verbal association, learning to perform the same content with tonal solfege or rhythm syllables and to label tonality, meter, and function. Third, partial synthesis, learning to compare a series of familiar patterns performed in two different contexts with the syllables removed. Fourth, symbolic association, learning to read and write familiar patterns based on how they sound. And fifth, composite synthesis, learning to read and write a series of familiar patterns and name the tonality or meter. Now let's look at the three levels of inference learning. Remember, inference learning means there's some amount of unfamiliar material, and the teacher is no longer giving the answer. The teacher is no longer modeling the skills. So the first of the three levels of inference learning is generalization. Generalization essentially just means students are teaching themselves. They are independently figuring out something that is unfamiliar at the level of generalization. This could be identifying the resting tone or macrobeat and microbeat of a new song. Generalization could be identifying the tonality or meter of a new song or an old song if the teacher has never explained the tonality or meter before. Generalization could be associating solfege to familiar and unfamiliar patterns that are heard on neutral syllables. So at generalization, I might, if students at verbal association had learned to chant patterns in duple meter with syllables, at generalization, the teacher might take the syllables away and ask the students to apply syllables to new patterns. So the teacher might say, ba-ba, ba-ba-ba, ba-ba-ba-ba, ba, do-ta, ta-do-ta, ta-do-ta-day, do. The student would chant it back with the syllables. That would be generalization or an example of generalization. Another example of generalization could be asking students to read or write unfamiliar patterns. Now, typically, generalization learning involves a combination of both unfamiliar and familiar material because we use the familiar to generalize to the unfamiliar. So again, generalization is figuring out something unfamiliar, something that the teacher hasn't previously told the answer to or previously hasn't modeled the skill for. The next level of inference learning after generalization is creativity improvisation. And as you'll see on the chart, if you're looking at it, there's a slash there. When I say creativity improvisation, it's creativity or improvisation. This is exactly what it sounds like. At creativity improvisation, students are coming up with new musical material, and that new material by its nature is unfamiliar because you can't predict what the students are going to come up with. At the creativity improvisation level, students might be creating or improvising tonal patterns, creating or improvising rhythm patterns, or creating or improvising in tonal and rhythm simultaneously. So things like melodies or new harmony parts or new accompaniment parts. Those could all be things that the students are coming up with at creativity improvisation. Now, you might be wondering why it's called creativity/improvisation. That's because in MLT, we use those terms creating and improvising very specifically. But I'm going to save that discussion for a future episode. I also want to note that the level of creativity improvisation could also include composing. Finally, the last level of inference learning is theoretical understanding. As Gordon explains on page 140 of his 2012 edition of Learning Sequences in Music, in theoretical understanding, students learn through intellectual understanding how and why they audiate as they do. I'm going to mention that again. At theoretical understanding, students learn how and why they audiate the way they do. Because it involves theoretical explanations of how music is constructed and used, theoretical understanding in music learning theory is similar to the learning of grammar when we're learning language. Quote, in language, grammar is taught only after students can use the language. In music learning theory, music theory rationally is taught only after students can audiate. That's from page 14 of Gordon's 2013 book, Quick and Easy Introduction, which you can get for only a penny through GIA. I'll link to that in the show notes. So again, it's only after students are audiating, they can perform music, they can read music with an understanding of what the symbols sound like, and they can come up with their own music. And only after all of those things are in place are we teaching them the explanations behind why music is put together the way it is. Examples of concepts that students might learn at theoretical understanding include individual pitches or durations within patterns, things like time value names, half steps or whole steps, and the construction of scales. They might learn intervals, pitch letter names, and so on. Those are all things that are learned under the theoretical understanding level of learning. So to recap the inference levels, first, generalization, figuring out something new independently. Second, creativity improvisation, making up original musical ideas. And finally, theoretical understanding, knowing how music is constructed and why we audiate music the way we do. Whew! Again, I plan on looking more closely at the levels of skill learning sequence in future episodes, devoting a whole episode to each level. Hopefully for now, though, this gives you a sense of the big picture of the skill learning sequence. Finally, I want to talk about how we can move through the skill learning sequence with our students. Remember that in episode 4 on common misconceptions of MLT, I emphasized that MLT is not a method. So the levels of skill learning sequence are not intended to be something that you have to proceed through linearly in a set fashion. There are different ways that you can move through the levels. You can navigate the skill learning sequence through either stepwise movement or bridging movement. When you move through skill learning sequence with stepwise movement, you're moving from one level to the next level immediately above or below it if you're looking at the chart. If you're moving through the skill learning sequence through bridging movement, that means you're temporarily moving from a level of discrimination learning to a level of inference learning and back again. So, for example, if your students had learned to recognize the tonality of familiar songs in major and minor at verbal association, you could bridge to generalization and ask them to identify the tonality of a new song that was in either major or minor. Another example of bridging could be if students had learned to echo rhythm patterns on neutral syllables in triple meter at aural. So if you're chanting ba 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 and the student is echoing ba 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 ba, You could bridge to creativity improvisation and ask students to create their own patterns on nutrisyllables and triple meter. So now you might chant to the student, ba 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 ba, ba 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 ba, and they might answer back, ba 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 ba. So they're coming up with their own rhythm. That would be an example of bridging from aural to creativity improvisation. One of the beautiful things I think about MLT is that once you're able to really wrap your brain around this skill learning sequence, you can use it flexibly to adapt learning experiences to the needs of your students at any point in time, even in the moment. For example, if you happen to be in the middle of a discrimination learning activity and realize your students are ready for a challenge, you could spontaneously incorporate a brief bridging experience to an inference level and then return to your original plan. You can do this in the moment by spontaneously bridging to inference learning with an individual student also. If you find that you have that student who's just getting a little too big for their britches, they think they know everything, you can throw them a little curveball. In addition to these in-the-moment decisions, skill learning sequence is incredibly helpful in guiding long-range planning and curriculum development. Also, being able to tweak an activity based on where your students are in the skill learning sequence means there's less need to use a huge number of songs to hold your students' interest. You don't need to have a whole new song and a whole new activity for everything to keep students engaged. You can simply tweak an existing song and activity to fit each new skill level, and it's like a whole new activity. This makes life as a music teacher so much easier when it comes to planning and preparing. Before I wrap up this discussion of skill learning sequence, I want to add a quick disclaimer that the skill learning sequence pertains to formal instruction, teaching concepts and skills and expecting students to get it on some level. But this is for students who are already starting to audiate tonally and rhythmically. Before students would be ready for these kinds of things that I've talked about with the skill learning sequence, which we call formal instruction, they would need informal experiences with music, a lot of informal experiences with music, where they can just get acculturated to the sounds of music, soak it all up, and develop a rich musical listening vocabulary, as well as experiment with the musical sounds that they're hearing. Those are all really important things to provide those opportunities for your students before you would try to teach the skills involved in the skill learning sequence. We'll talk in a future episode about how to guide students in these kinds of informal experiences with music so that they'll have the readiness to develop skills through formal instruction with the skill learning sequence. I just don't want to leave you thinking that you can just pick up on day one with your students and have them be successful with all of the skills in the skill learning sequence immediately. So let's step back and connect the skill learning sequence with the whole part whole process in MLT. Again, the whole refers to context, tonality, and meter, which students experience through repertoire. The part refers to content, tonal patterns, and rhythm patterns. And through the skill learning sequence, students learn to audiate, perform, and interact with patterns in a variety of ways by developing different musical skills. Through pattern instruction, students develop each skill and then apply that skill back to the repertoire, the final whole in the whole part whole process. Because students have developed skills in conjunction with tonal patterns and rhythm patterns, they will return to the whole with greater understanding and can listen to and make music with greater meaning because they better understand how music is put together. Whew. Well, I hope this second series of episodes has helped you think about ways that you can help your students audiate context and content and how you might help them develop a variety of musical skills in a sequential way. In future episodes, we will be talking all about how to apply these ideas in the classroom, including activities you can try with your students. So make sure you're subscribed on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts, or follow the Everyday Musicality podcast page on Facebook so you will never miss an episode. Before I go, I also wanted to let you know that the Gordon Institute for Music Learning, commonly referred to as GIML, they're planning to run some one-week online Introduction to Music Learning Theory courses this summer that may be of interest. Every summer, GIML hosts 2-week professional development levels courses, but unfortunately many of these are having to cancel due to COVID-19. However, a number of these sites will instead be hosting these 1-week online intro courses. These courses will meet for 3 hours a day for a total of 15 hours over the 1 week, and they'll be specific to an area of specialization. So there will be courses focusing on MLT and elementary general music, instrumental music, and early childhood music. If you've enjoyed these first 2 series of episodes on the basics of MLT, you might enjoy getting to spend 15 hours on these ideas and how they can be applied in the classroom in specific settings. These online courses will be taught by GIML faculty. The details are still being worked out, but more info will be available soon, so check the GIML website for more on those courses at www.giml.org. This is the first time ever that GIML is running official online courses. So this is a great way to get into MLT, particularly if you live in an area where there isn't a GIML chapter nearby. And now it's time to announce the winner of our second giveaway from sponsor GIA Publications. Thank you to everyone who entered by sharing the podcast on social media. The lucky winner is Erin Brauka. Erin, please email your preferred mailing address to everydaymusicality@gmail.com, and I'll get that free copy of Eric Bluestein's Intro to MLT, The Ways Children Learn Music, out to you ASAP. If you didn't win, I'm planning a future series all about music aptitude, in which the giveaway will be one of Dr. Gordon's published aptitude tests valued at $100. So keep listening to find out how to enter the next giveaway from GIA Publications. Finally, I want to let you know that I'm going on a brief hiatus for the next month or so because I really need to get my book wrapped up. I absolutely love doing this podcast, but from brainstorming and scripting to recording and editing the audio, each episode does take me anywhere from 3 to 5 hours to produce. Believe it or not, I'm pretty slow. So right now, I really need to commit that time to the final push on getting my book out into the world. So I will call this the end of Season 1 of Everyday Musicality, and I can't wait to be back with Season 2, hopefully in June. In the meantime, if you have questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, please get in touch. You can email me or send me a voice memo at everydaymusicality@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. Thanks for listening, and let's keep musicking every day. Good job.